So here's where it all goes wrong. Last week we looked at chapter 2, which paints a wonderful picture of life as it was meant to be. Life in the garden. Men and women in close relationship with and easy communication with God. Living in harmony with the rest of creation. Comfortable with themselves and their lives. And living in loving relationship with each other. And now it all falls apart through their choice to disobey God. Now they're afraid of God and they hide from Him. They don't want to talk to Him. They accuse each other of being at fault, refusing to accept their own guilt. Even so, they feel ashamed of themselves and their nakedness. They hide. And God says that from now on they're going to find themselves battling against each other and against the natural environment. Life is going to get difficult in all sorts of ways. It's a tragic story. It's our story. That's why we're where we are today. It's why our world and our lives are in the mess they are today. It's all laid out for us clearly here in Genesis chapter 3. Once again, I'll mention the fact that some Christians view this as literally what happened to Adam and Eve, whereas others think this historical account of our earliest ancestors has been simplified in some way so that the underlying truth and meaning can be more readily understood. And that debate runs through these first 11 chapters of Genesis that I'm going to be preaching on before, as I believe it, we get to Abraham and a straightforward record of history. But these very ancient accounts here perhaps have been written in a slightly different style. But however we view that, what this chapter teaches is crystal clear, that we have turned away from God and it has spoiled life. Big time, as they say. And what's more, there's no going back. There's no going back to that idyllic existence in the garden that the garden represents. There's no way back to the promise of eternal life that tree of life represents. There's a flaming sword, we read, standing in the way. Well, the rest of the Bible makes it very plain that disobedient, sinful people cannot approach a holy God. It's just not possible. God had no choice but to banish them from the garden. So there's no going back. Or is there? I'll come back to that later. This chapter is just packed full of seemingly endless amounts of sermon subjects. I'm quite sure it's the one chapter I refer back to more often than any other in my preaching generally. Well, this morning I want to mention 5 things quite briefly. They're the 5 things I've noted on the handouts. The first is Satan. That's who the serpent is. If there was any doubt at all about that, then there's a verse in Revelation that gives us the key, speaking about that ancient serpent who is the devil. It was he who tempted Eve to disobey God. And he may have appeared literally as a serpent talking to her, or he may have tempted Eve in the same way as he tempts you and I today. That subtle voice feeding thoughts into our minds. I don't know. His appearance, of course, raises all sorts of questions about who he is, where he came from, what is he up to. As best I can understand it, he's a kind of fallen angel. There are verses in Isaiah and Ezekiel I think do imply that. Meaning that he's a spiritual being who's set himself up in opposition to God. He's a powerful spiritual being. But he is still a created being. And therefore ultimately no match for God. And yet, like us, appears to have been granted free will, and is therefore able to choose to defy God and oppose him. And we, the people of this world, are the primary targets in this ongoing battle. The devil seeking to draw us away and keep us away from God, while God seeks to draw us to himself. Though again, let me say, Satan is no match for God, such that when we choose God and his way, Satan has no power to prevent us. I believe in the devil. Why? First, because the Bible tells us he exists. Jesus clearly thought so. Second, because I can think of no better explanation for the evil that is so obviously prevalent in our world. And third, because of my own experience as an individual Christian and as part of Christian fellowships, feeling that opposition which comes in all kinds of guises. But especially when good things are happening in our lives or in our churches, we face that opposition in some way or other. But again here, when we keep trusting in God, we will prevail. I think we need to be clear, though, that the devil's presence and influence did not absolve Adam and Eve from guilt. They chose to listen to Satan rather than God, chose not to trust God's word, chose to do what they knew was against God's wishes. And so the rot set in. Sin entered into them and into the human race. And ever since we've all been in the same boat, as they say, as Adam and Eve. Sin has infected us like a contagious disease. It enslaves us like chains put onto a prisoner. Although at the same time the situation is one of our own making. Due to our selfishness, our pride, our refusal to submit to God. Who can set us free from the devil and from our own broken selves? Another question I'll come back to later. But next, let's think a bit more about the nature of sin. That eating of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as it's described here. Whether in actual fact Eve did literally sin by eating a piece of fruit, maybe, or whether that action represents to us a more subtle and more general heart change within Eve and then within Adam in rebellion to God, I don't know. But as I explained last week, I think that what eating from the tree means is to gain knowledge of good and evil by experiencing both good and evil, which meant choosing to do what God had forbidden. Eve saw that the fruit was good for food, pleasing to the eye, and desirable for gaining wisdom. So she took it and ate it. Interestingly, back in chapter 2, we read that God had made all kinds of trees that were all good for food and pleasing to the eye. And most of which they were entirely free to eat from. All except this one. And sin often comes as something that was created good, as a gift from God. And the sin is to use it in the wrong way. So, for example, picking up again on thoughts from chapter 2, God gave us the good gift of sex, but gave it its proper use, or gave it its proper place within marriage. And we are not to go looking for it on the wrong tree, as it were. Sin is very much about doing things to please ourselves and to better ourselves, even if it's at the expense of others. Even if it goes against God's way. That moral code of right and wrong, the knowledge of which I believe He's planted in all of our hearts, but sadly we can learn to ignore it. Eve looked and she thought, that looks nice. I bet it would taste nice. I'm sure I can handle the consequences. After all, I know best. And Adam followed suit. But the consequences for Adam and Eve, and so for the human race, were disastrous. All those things I summarised at the beginning of my sermon, but most disastrous of all, that separation from God, from which everything else then followed. More detail is given here in these curses pronounced by God. Christians read these verses sometimes in different ways, but the overall effect is clear. Life becomes a struggle in all kinds of ways. Family life is no longer the joy that it was. Verse 16, pain in childbearing. Might mean physical pain or emotional pain or probably both. Also that essential equality between man and woman, between husband and wife that was described in the first 2 chapters of Genesis is lost here. The man now ruling over the woman, we're told. One interesting point regarding translation is that instead of your desire will be for your husband, it could be translated your desire was for your husband, where desire is a controlling desire. Same word is used of Cain killing Abel later because sin was controlling him. So part of Eve's sin was therefore, on that reading, trying to dominate and control her husband. But now she and all women will suffer the opposite. Mankind's interaction with nature, with the ground and with the plants, it says here, also goes awry. The ground is hard to work. Thorns and thistles grow. And that may mean that nature itself changed. Maybe dramatically as a result of mankind's sin. A catalogue of effects went into nature itself, even the laws of nature. Or it might still all be seen as a consequence of us changing. I mean, just imagine what things would be like now if we were still in the image of God as we were first made, which essentially means being Christ-like. Imagine what level of understanding we'd have of nature and how it works. Imagine what level of control we may have over nature even. We'd be able to handle things like disease and what we call natural disasters in a totally different way. Well, we can't look back now and see what things would have been like, what they might have been like. What we know is that as a result of sin, life is now a continuous struggle in all kinds of ways. But the worst consequence of all is death. Death in the Bible can have 2 meanings, physical death or spiritual death, or sometimes both. When Jesus said, I tell you the truth, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death. Clearly he didn't mean, in that case, that we would not physically die, but that we would not die in the spiritual sense, if we keep his words. In other words, we wouldn't, in the sense that we wouldn't be cut off from God. Here in Genesis 2 and 3, there's no doubt that spiritual death is the primary meaning, because that's what happens immediately. Adam and Eve sin, whoosh, they're separated from God. Does it mean physical death too? That's a point which is much debated. Adam and Eve didn't die, at least straight away, but of course they did eventually, after they sinned. When God talks about Adam returning to the ground from where he came, it could be part of the curse, or it could be a statement about what happened anyway. Some believe Adam and Eve were originally created immortal and would live forever as they were. Others that some kind of transition from these mortal bodies of ours to our future immortal bodies was always going to take place. Though I feel sure that if so, it would have been in a far, far less traumatic way than death comes to us now. Maybe more like that which we see described in the Bible for the likes of Enoch or Elijah, who it seems were simply taken up into heaven when their time came. I don't know. but due once again to sin. Death is now our enemy in every sense, but most seriously in the spiritual sense. A death which separates us from God. A death that will be permanent if no solution is found. Is there any hope for us? Praise be to God. He has provided the solution in Jesus. We've just been singing about it. Jesus has defeated Satan. Jesus has defeated sin. Jesus has defeated death. Most importantly of all, he has reconciled us to God. And one day he will reverse all of those curses that sin brought about. And putting our faith in Jesus and in his saving work on the cross is the solution for us, is the guaranteed solution if we will simply trust in him. And you know what? The signposts of his future coming are to be found right here in Genesis 3. Knowing what we do of Jesus and looking back, we can see them here. We can see God's grace and love and intention to rescue his creation, even here. The simple fact that God talks about Eve's offspring, and knowing that Eve's very name means mother of all the living, tells us that God is not giving up on his world, not giving up on us. He's not going to destroy everything else now. Then, life will continue, even though things have gone wrong. Also here, there's one of my favourite moments in the whole of the Bible. God has just given Adam and Eve the telling off of all telling offs, basically here. Get out, he says, away from my sight. My words, dramatising things. Oh, but just hang on a minute. It's a bit thorny and thistly out there. You'll need these clothes. It always takes my mind to one of my other favourite places in the Bible. As you know, the parable of the lost son, the prodigal son, the father who allows his rebellious son to leave home because that's what he's chosen. And the father who never stops then looking out for him to come back, longing for him to return because he loves him so much. The same loving God I see pictured here in this beautiful scene in the garden. The parable of the lost son may be a made-up story, but because Jesus made it up, we know that parable speaks the truth about God and our relationship with him, our need to come back to him. Similarly with this account in the Garden of Eden, whether it's literally true or whether the truth is being presented in another way, at the end of the day it doesn't really matter because these are God's words we're reading. And if they're God's words we're reading, then the truth shines through. Especially about his love for us and his longing for us to come back to him. There's more. Notice that the clothes God gives to Adam and Eve are animal skins. God has sacrificed something of his own creation to help them, pointing forward to the day when he would sacrifice his own son to bring us aid. And earlier on, verse 15, we read of Eve's offspring as a person who would one day crush the head of the serpent. Who else but Jesus fits the bill? This chapter lays out clearly for us the tragedy that is the fall, as it's often referred to. But it also records the very beginnings of God's salvation plan to lift us up once again.